This screencast is on learning and behavior. I love this material and it's really fascinating to learn. A lot of times students think they understand this stuff based on reading the text, but if we go into a little more detail and I explain it to you, I think you'll have a much better understanding, and these principles can have a huge impact on your life. So when you learn about this material, I want you to think of kids and pets. So start there. How does this affect learning and behavior? Okay, the first person that we really need to talk about is Pavlov. So Pavlov is a brilliant scientist, not a psychologist though. He really started off studying salivation of dogs. He was looking at the digestive system of dogs. But his experiments didn't go as planned. Remember we talked about like a hypothesis, and if it's not proven that you can readjust your hypothesis. Pavlov was a good scientist. So when he was getting results that he wasn't expecting, he changed his hypothesis and really kind of stumbled onto this idea of learning that we'll call classical conditioning. And he won a Nobel Prize for this. So there's Pavlov and one of his dogs. Now what they would do is they would put the dogs in a harness. Okay? Then they would have this cannula that was connected to the salivary glands of the dog. And then there was a device that would count the drops of saliva that would come down, and then they would record the data. And so they would present the dog with food and then measure the salivary response to that. Okay? But something was happening. So Pavlov would come marching down the hall with the dog food, ready for his experiment, and the dogs would start salivating when they heard Pavlov's footsteps down the hall. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse. So they were salivating in response to no food. Well, what was happening? Well, you've always heard of how this experiment was set up. I'm sure you've heard of this before. If not, pay attention here because this is very important. What we're going to have is unconditioned stimuluses, a conditioned stimulus, an unconditioned response, and a conditioned response. Okay, this is where it gets confusing, but I'd like to try and make this pretty easy for you. Unconditioned, or U here, an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Think of unconditioned that it means it happens naturally. So you present a dog with a bone, they start drooling. Now, if you present a dog with a bell, what happens? Well, they might look at the bell or something like that, but they're not going to salivate in response to the bell. However, during this process of learning, which we call conditioning, if you present the bell with the food and it follows the food reasonably, I mean, like there's not a huge gap between the two of them so that the bell can predict the food, after a while, the bell itself is going to be able to elicit salivation in the dog. So the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus. Remember, think stimulus response, stimulus response. It always goes in that order. This is conditioned. This is the learned response, the CS, and then CR, conditioned response, the learned response. So unconditioned happens naturally. Conditioned, it takes learning. The unconditioned response and the conditioned response are always going to be the same thing. Here, salivation. Alright, so go home. Try this. If you have a dog, take your milk bone box and shake it around. Some of you can't even say the word walk in front of your dog. I hear people do this all the time. They're like, we can't even say the word WLK in front of our dog because the dog gets so excited. Saying the word walk becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the dog acting all hyper or whatever is a conditioned response. So that right there is classical conditioning. It involves placing a neutral signal before a natural reflex. So the neutral signal would be the bell, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, again, would be the food, and then the reflex is the salivation, or the unconditioned response, and then the conditioned response. So classical condition focuses on involuntary and automatic behaviors. If you get confused with this, go back and study this chart over and over and over again. It gets confusing. We could go over to a grad school in psychology and we could get grad students confused on this all day long. Now, this is definitely like a midterm question. Might not be this exact question, but if you go to the dentist's office and you hear the noise of the drill, but you are in the lobby of the dentist's office and you wince, the dentist's drill becomes a conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response is you wincing. So you initially sat down in the dentist's chair and he drilled your tooth, and that probably hurt. That is a unconditioned stimulus. So when that hurt, you were in that chair and you went, ow! That is an unconditioned response. It happens naturally. But the sound of that drill didn't do anything to you. That the sound is the the conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is the actual drilling of your tooth that hurts. So when you later hear that conditioned stimulus and you're in the lobby of the dentist's office, you have the conditioned response. All right, the next person I want to talk about just a little bit is Edward Thorndike. He kind of comes along in the line here. He created this box called a puzzle box, and he would take little cats and he would lock the cats in this little kitty jail, and there was a specific way that you could escape this puzzle box, and the cats would go in there and he would not feed them so they were hungry, and he'd put a bowl of food outside the puzzle box, and so the cats would stick their little paws out through the little bars there, and there were all sorts of things that they could kind of pull on to try and open up the doors. But one of these opened up the doors. So you put the cat in the box and you measure what the cat does, and the cat kind of wanders around and does random kitty behavior, and all of a sudden, like most of the responses, not going to elicit anything. All of a sudden, one response will pop this little door open and the cat can come running out and get the food. Now, you put the cat back in the box, what's the cat going to do? The cat's going to go right over and do the thing that happened right before it got out. So what is that? That's called the law of effect. And the law of effect, hold on a second here, says that responses that produce a satisfying effect in a particular situation become more likely to occur again in that situation, and responses that produce a discomforting effect will be less likely to occur again in that situation. So I don't know. I mean, I can think examples for me are like when I'm mountain biking and I do something dumb and I fall and I hurt myself, and I say, oh man, that was dumb, I'm not going to do that again. And it's really similar to this. So if you do something and it's followed by something positive, you're more likely to do that behavior again in that situation. If it's followed by something that's negative or discomforting, then you're less likely to do that in that situation again. The next person we need to go to is Watson. So that's John B. Watson right there. He's a very famous psychologist. And this is his famous quote. He said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestry. I'm going beyond my facts, and I admit to it, but so have the advocates of the contrary, and they have been doing it for many thousands of years." So what does that mean? Well, Watson really believed in this idea of a blank slate, or tabula rasa. That was like John Locke's idea. That we weren't predetermined to become whatever it is we become. It's our environment and how the environment shapes us. This is like that nature versus nurture debate. This is all nurture. So whatever happens to you in your life, the set of circumstances that you encounter end up influencing what you become later on in life. So let's take artists. So if Watson wanted a kid to become an artist, he would have that child reared in his house, and anytime the kid did anything artistic, he would reinforce it. And anytime the kid did anything that was not artistic, he would not reinforce it. So that's what became radical behaviorism. And behaviorism really doesn't care about your thoughts or your thinking or cognition. All it cares about is what happens to you in your environment. The famous study that Watson did with Rosalie Rayner, who is right here, and I'm sure the book or the video that you watch probably not going to tell you that he had a extramarital affair with Rosalie Rayner. Well, she was a graduate student and they later got married. But she was instrumental in helping him with his research. Here is little Albert, and you can see little Albert there playing with a white rat. And little Albert is not afraid of the white rat. Well, Watson goes up behind little Albert and like bangs on a gong, makes a super loud noise, and scares little Albert while he's playing with the rat. Afterwards, little Albert is afraid of the rat because the rat was present when he heard that huge noise. Now think about any of you that might have a fear or phobia of something. A good example is like frogs. So maybe you were out with your parents and you're a little child, you don't even remember this, and you go to grab a frog. Or maybe your parents are afraid of dogs and you go to pet a dog and your mother or father screams and they're like, "No, don't pet the dog, don't pet the frog," and it scares you as a little kid. You then have that emotional response to the paired object. Does that make sense? So now when little Albert sees anything that's white and fluffy, even if it's not a rat, he becomes fearful of it. So this study demonstrated how emotions could actually become conditioned responses. Now, the first psychological behavior therapy was created by a woman named Mary Cover Jones, and she desensitized people to the conditioning of fears or phobias. Unfortunately, little Albert got away, so we have no clue what happened to little Albert. Now, the next guy on the list is B.F. Skinner, or Burrhus Frederick Skinner, who's a Harvard psychologist. Now, he worked a lot with animals, but he also worked with people. He created this thing called a Skinner box. Look at your book for a picture of a Skinner box. But here you can see all these pigeons in a box. And a lot of times, his experiments would teach pigeons to do things that were not natural. Okay, so there's a Skinner box right there. Now, look at the floor. There might be a shock generator down here, and it's not going to really, like, hurt the animal. Well, I guess it does hurt the animal, but it'd be equivalent to, like, static electricity shock, something like that. It's not going to kill the animal. And then here, there's a little window that'll open up, and food will pop out. Sometimes they'll have, like liquids, like juice or something like that. And then there's like levers for the animal to respond. And then there might be speakers or lights, like a green light and a red light. And depending on the paradigm, you program these. And you can have fixed intervals where the rat can respond once in like 1 minute, or variable intervals where it depends on time. So like one time the rat might be able to respond once in a minute, and then food will come out, and then they might have to wait like 10 minutes, and then food will come out. You don't get very good responding with that. Where it's every minute they can respond, you get pretty good responses. So those are fixed interval and variable interval, so FI or VI. And then they can also respond with ratios, so the number of responses. A fixed ratio would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then food comes out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then food comes out. You get pretty good responding with that. So think about like your paycheck that comes every 2 weeks. And then, you have to show up to work like every 10 days, and then you get paid. 10 days, and then you get paid. 10 days, and then you get paid. Or you can have a variable ratio where you go 1, 2, and then food comes out. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then food comes out. And then 1, and then food. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then food comes out. That's called a variable ratio responding. And that's how you get the highest response rates. Think about a slot machine. It's the same exact idea. And that's how you get the highest frequency of response rates. So that's a Skinner box. Now, over here is something that's kind of interesting. That's Skinner's daughter. Her name's Deborah. That's a crib that he had built that really kind of resembled a Skinner box. And although Skinner did study reinforcement in humans, he says he didn't do it in his daughter. Now, I don't know if I necessarily believe that. He said that this was a climate-controlled and humidity-controlled crib because at that time they lived in Minnesota, so the kid would not have to wear clothes and get rashes and stuff like that. I don't know if I believe that. However, I had a professor that actually dated Deborah Skinner, and he said that she was remarkably normal. Okay, now, this is the confusing part. So pay attention and take notes. Reinforcement versus punishment. Anytime you hear the word reinforcement, a reinforcer increases the frequency of a behavior over time. A punishment decreases the frequency of a behavior over time. Learn that. Okay, that's the first step. That's the most important thing. Anytime you see the word reinforcement, you think increases behavior. Anytime you see punishment, decreases behavior. Now, we need to differentiate between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Again, this is confusing. Take notes. But listen up here, because I think this is pretty easy once it's explained to you. Positive, so think the word positive is like addition. You add something. Negative is like subtraction. That means you take something away. A positive reinforcer would be like anytime a kid cleans up their room, you give them M&Ms. Hopefully, you'll increase the frequency that they'll clean their room. A negative reinforcer, again, we want to increase the frequency of a behavior over time. Means you take something away. Here we see escape. So what would that be like? Well, think about an annoying stimulus that you want to get away from, but we want to increase the frequency of the behavior. A good example of that would be a fire alarm. So the fire alarm goes off. We want you to run out of the building. We hope that every time you hear the fire alarm, it's going to increase the frequency of you running out of the behavior. When you run out of the room, you get away from that annoying alarm noise. You escape it. Does that make sense? I have more examples on this in just a second. Now, punishment over here, again, decreasing the frequency of a behavior. And no, I want to note here that anything can be a reinforcer. Anything in the world, as long as it increases the frequency of a behavior. So it could be congratulations, it could be a hug, it could be M&Ms, it could be money, it could be anything in the world. Juice, marshmallows, food, tokens, a ticket, anything can be a reinforcer. Now punishment, again, we want to decrease the frequency of a behavior over time. So let's say your kid's being a jerk. I don't know, they're acting up at the dinner table and they're really acting up. They're throwing a temper tantrum. You want to decrease the frequency of these temper tantrums in the future. So what do? Well, positive punishment, add something. You could smack them. You could spank them. Or negative punishment, removal punishment. You can take something away. Like you could take away their Wii or their Xbox. You see how that works? Now, I really like reinforcement over punishment. Punishment doesn't really teach anything. Reinforcement, on the other hand, teaches new behaviors. There's lots of negative stuff that can happen with punishment. And one thing that can happen is kids see parents punishing them, and they take those behaviors and they reenact them in their life. And, like it might include hitting or something like that. The kids can get in a lot of trouble. It also teaches the kids that they can get away with the behavior if they just don't get caught. So that's not good either. Reinforcement is far superior to punishment in terms of shaping behavior. If you're constantly punishing your kids, it's going to affect your relationship with them in a negative way. If you're constantly reinforcing your kids, it's probably going to have a positive impact on your relationship with them. Okay, so this is called operant conditioning. So this is operating on the environment, and it involves applying reinforcement or punishment after a behavior. It focuses on strengthening or weakening voluntary behaviors. So your kid does their homework, well, you could spank them after they do their homework. That's going to be a punishment. They're not going to likely do their homework, but you could also give them a piece of cake after they do their homework, and hopefully that would reinforce the behavior. Unless a kid doesn't like cake. That's a good point. So it's highly individual what is actually a reinforcer or a punisher. Okay, so here's your quiz. You put on your seatbelt in your car. Why do you do this? Well, you were probably reinforced for it. And that negative seatbelt noise, what is that? Is that positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment? Again, I'll wait for you here. Guess which one? It's actually negative reinforcement. Because you have that annoying seatbelt noise. You sit in your car and it goes ding, 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 ding until you put the seatbelt on. And then you put the seatbelt on, it removes the noise. What about your alarm clock? What is that? Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment? Well, it depends on how you talk about this. But if you are like me and you constantly hit the snooze button so you can sleep a little longer, that's negative reinforcement again. Okay, let's talk about some practical issues. Look at these three lovely kids. They're in the cereal aisle. Cereal aisle and the candy aisle and the toy aisle and grocery stores are just hotbeds of child behavior problems. And why is that? Well, think about what a kid does when he goes into the cereal aisle. They want Lucky Charms, chocolate honeycomb, or Fruit Loops. What does a kid do to get cereal? Well, some kids might say, Mom or Dad, could I please have this cereal? The parent says, no. And then the kid is quiet after that. I wasn't like that as a kid. I bet you weren't like that as a kid either. So what do? You say, please let me have the Lucky Charms. I want Lucky Charms. You act up. Now, the parent has a number of choices of what they can do. Think about these principles that we learned. What if the parent says no? And the kid goes, but I want it so bad. And they flip out in the grocery store. They really start causing a scene. Well, a lot of parents are going to go, fine, you want the Lucky Charms that bad? Here. And they give them the Lucky Charms. What did they just do? Did they decrease the frequency of that behavior or increase the frequency? They actually increased it because they added a reinforcer, the Lucky Charms. So the next time the kid goes in the grocery store and the parent says no, it's going to be the same thing over again because the parents taught them that that's what they need to do to get the cereal. One of my favorite examples was I worked with kids that had behavior problems, and I worked with this one young guy in middle school, and he kept acting up in the classroom. And the teacher would send him out of the classroom and tell him to go sit in the hallway. And the kid just kept getting worse and worse and worse, and every day he was going out in the hallway. Well, what was actually happening? Well, the kid hated sitting in the classroom. The classroom was boring. If you could go out in the hallway, this is in Florida, so it's like sunny and nice outside, and there's all sorts of other kids walking around. It was reinforcing his behavior. So the teacher thought she was punishing him by sending him out of the classroom, but in fact it was a negative reinforcement, because being in the classroom was an annoying stimulus, and if he acted up, he would get to escape the annoying stimulus and go out in the hallway. So it ended up that the kid was acting up 5 days a week, 4 weeks out of the month, and was failing the class because the teacher was reinforcing the behavior. All right, now this next video is a little annoying, but I want you to try and think about what you would do in this situation. Okay, so this is in a Target. Oh, my internet's running a little slow. So in a Target, somebody's got their video camera because this is so extreme. Can you hear the kid yelling, "I want toys"? Oh, we don't want that link. I can't get rid of this link, sorry. See the little kid right there freaking out? Alright, so he's screaming, "I want toys! I want toys!" Okay, and don't click on the link for formula for toddlers either. Alright, what is that? What would you do? What if you were a parent and that was your kid freaking out in Target, screaming, "I want toys"? What would you do? Would you just give them the toy to shut them up? Would you spank them? Would you ignore the behavior? What would you do based on these principles of learning? Think about that one. All right, so that's it for this chapter. You have a video to watch for it as well. So make sure you watch that, and you should have these principles and understand all this material for the midterm. Again, contact me if you have any questions or concerns.